The Bluevale Manor stood skeletal against the bruised, moonless sky, its third-story windows like vacant, milky eyes staring out over the overgrown lane. The eaves dripped with the condensation of decades, and the once grand limestone facade was scarred with black, wet mold. For Chloe, the house was a monumental thrill, a genuine brick-and-mortar legend waiting to be documented by her shaky camcorder. For Sarah, however, it was just cold concrete, a profound sense of foreboding, and the sickly, cloying smell of long-dead things. Still, she'd promised her best friend she'd come along, camcorder and flashlight in hand, to capture the night. "Are you sure about this, Chloe? It smells like wet dirt and despair out here, and the silence is screaming," Sarah muttered, pulling her jacket tighter as the bitter, late autumn air bit at her exposed neck. Chloe, already setting up her EMF meter and digital thermometer near the sagging, splintered porch, beamed. Her eyes held the glint of a dedicated, if reckless, investigator. "This is it, Sarah. Old Lady Bluevale. Eleanor died right here in the main hall in 42. They say she still patrols the entryway, consumed by rage and searching for the sterling silver pocket watch the first responders supposedly stole off her cooling corpse. Tonight, we confirm the legend. They had parked a quarter-mile down the road to avoid drawing attention, climbing over a low, rusty gate to reach the driveway. The front door of the manor, heavy and dark mahogany, hung slightly ajar, inviting and menacing all at once. The gap revealed a sliver of impenetrable darkness within. It was a door that hadn't seen a friendly knock in over 70 years, and likely never would again. "Okay, plan is simple," Chloe whispered, her voice husky with strained excitement. "I checked the temperature and static energy. You film everything. Focus on the landing. No running unless the EMF meter peaks past 9. Got it?" Sarah gripped the camcorder, the plastic cool against her already sweaty palm, the silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of her own heartbeat. "Got it. But if a rat so much as squeaks, or if I hear a noise that isn't decaying wood, I reserve the right to deploy the car key alarm and run until my lungs collapse." With a shared, shaky breath, Chloe used the sole of her boot to push the door inward. It didn't produce the satisfying haunted groan they might have expected. Instead, it simply shuddered inward against the ancient, moth-eaten carpet, releasing a gust of air that hit them like a physical blow. It smelled profoundly of dust, rot, burnt sugar, and a sharp metallic tang of cold that had nothing to do with the outside weather. The interior was a vast, light-swallowing cavern of shadow, the ceiling impossibly high, illuminated only by their struggling flashlight beams. They were standing precisely on the threshold, 1 foot in the relative safety of the porch light, 1 foot in the manor's crushing, malevolent dark. That's when it happened. It wasn't a whisper, a creak, or a moan. It was an impact, and it was violently physical. A solid, fist-sized rock, jagged, cold, and heavy, shot out of the absolute darkness inside the main hall. It flew with deadly force, striking the thick mahogany doorframe inches above Sarah's head. The force of the throw was tremendous. The rock splintered the dry wood with a loud, sickening crack, sending wood shrapnel flying past Sarah's ear before it clattered onto the floor directly between their feet. The raw physical violence instantly killed all rational thought. This wasn't a breeze or a sound effect. This was an attack. Chloe screamed, a high, sharp sound that tasted of pure, panicked terror. Sarah didn't bother reaching for the car alarm. She was already stumbling backward, pulling Chloe with her, but the curiosity or the pure animal fear had frozen Chloe's feet to the spot, locking her gaze on the entryway. "What was that? Who's here? Stop!" Sarah yelled into the echoing void, shining the flashlight beam wildly around the cavernous, dusty hall. There was no visible hiding place, no shadow large enough to conceal a living person who could have launched that heavy stone. The attack felt instantaneous, thrown from the heart of the darkness itself. The EMF meter Chloe had set down on the porch began to wail, a synthetic, terrified sound. It wasn't the usual gentle spike. It was a sustained, piercing shriek that peaked the needle into the red zone, sounding like a desperate fire alarm for the spiritual realm. The temperature in the immediate vicinity plummeted so fast that Sarah could feel a painful, icy ache in her lungs. And she could see their breath clouding instantly, thick and white, despite the fact they were still near the open door. A thin, reedy noise started from the top of the grand staircase, which ascended into the gloom like a dark, winding spine. It was a sound like dry leaves scraping pavement, or an old woman's muffled, exhausted, yet fiercely angry sobbing. Chloe stopped screaming and went eerily still, her eyes fixed on the staircase's apex. "Sarah, the watch," she breathed, her voice barely a thread of sound, realizing that their presence had provoked something far beyond their control. Sarah followed the flashlight beam, pointing it toward the shadowed second-floor landing. The sobs intensified, now sounding closer to an unnerving, high-pitched wailing, mixed with a palpable sense of injustice. Then, out of the deep shadow near the landing's balustrade, it manifested. It wasn't a shimmering form or a vague, translucent mist. It was an old woman, as clear and solid in appearance as the ruined walls around her, but fundamentally, horribly wrong. She was wearing a thick black dress of heavy, velvet-like material, a style long forgotten, but her true horror lay in her presence. Her skin was a translucent, pale gray, drawn taut over the bone structure, and her lips were thin, pulled back in a permanent dry rictus of pain and unrelenting fury. Her eyes were sunken pits of utter darkness, devoid of reflection or light, and her brittle white hair seemed to crackle with a halo of raw, static energy. But it was her hands that finally made Sarah drop the camcorder into the thick dust. The old woman's arms were extended slightly forward, her spectral fingers curled into hard, claw-like hooks, and from her mouth, which wasn't visibly moving, came the sound of the wailing, now mixed with a wet, grinding hiss, as if she were breathing sand. She wasn't looking for a watch. She was looking at them, and her expression was one of absolute, unadulterated territorial rage. And she was moving. She began to glide down the staircase, foot by silent foot. She didn't float, but took the steps with a deliberate, haunting motion, the skirt of her heavy black dress somehow trailing on the air itself without a sound. Every inch she descended, the air grew colder, and the EMF meter, still lying on the floor, managed one final violent spasm before its light finally died. The old woman stopped 6 steps from the bottom, her presence dominating the massive hall. She tilted her head, and the dead dark eyes focused entirely, piercingly on Chloe. Chloe didn't hesitate this time. She let out a guttural shriek that wasn't human, finally breaking the paralysis that had gripped her. She didn't look back at the descending specter. She just threw herself past the rock and the broken EMF meter, scrambling out the open door and onto the porch. Sarah followed instantly, slamming her shoulder into the porch railing, tasting dust and terror. They didn't slow down until they reached the car, driving away in a frantic, skidding panic, leaving behind only the cold wind and the awful, tangible silence of the house. They never spoke about the rock again, the proof of a solid, violent entity. They only spoke of the old woman, of the absolute, bone-deep hatred she had radiated, and the certainty that whatever had thrown the stone was simply her way of clearing the doorway before her chilling physical presence could come to claim them both. The manor wasn't just haunted, it was actively, violently angry, and they had been foolish enough to stand in its way. Jason, a man who saw ghost hunting less as a spiritual calling and more as a highly competitive hobby, stepped across the threshold of St. Jude's Sanatorium with a bored professional swagger. He needed content. Views had been down, and his rival, Spectral Sam, had just uploaded a shaky video from an old prison that was getting serious traction. The air was thick with the scent of aged plaster, rot, and the metallic tang of dried dust. But to Jason, it smelled like an average Tuesday night, or more precisely, like viral gold waiting to be captured. St. Jude's had been shuttered for 40 years, following allegations of systemic patient mistreatment and a catastrophic, unexplained fire that took out the entire West Wing. It was a textbook location. High trauma, decades of neglect, and a local legend involving a particularly cruel matron whose shadow was said to still enforce silence in the hallways. Right, let's make this quick, Jason muttered to his camcorder, adjusting the powerful headlamp strapped to his forehead. His tone was dismissive, almost mocking, designed for his audience. It's 2 a.m., and I've got 3 other most haunted spots to hit before sunrise, if I want to stay ahead of the game. If you entities could kindly throw a chair, whisper something discernible, or give me a decent light anomaly, I'd appreciate the cooperation. He navigated the ground floor, his heavy boots crushing shards of broken marble and kicking up flakes of lead paint in the former administrative offices. He paused by a filing cabinet, its drawers spilling moldering documents, patient files, attendance records, their histories decaying into illegible powder. The stillness here wasn't eerie, it was just still, the deep silence of a place that had died violently and suddenly. Residual energy, he always scoffed, was usually just a draft, magnetic interference, or an acoustic anomaly bouncing sound off hard, empty walls. He checked his EMF reader, flatlined just as expected. He recorded his observations for 10 minutes in the dilapidated lobby, a cavern of broken marble and water damage, and felt nothing but rising frustration. See? He addressed the camera, panning across the decaying reception desk. Just a big, cold, empty building. Nothing angry, nothing sad, just concrete and regret. Where's the action, St. Jude's? Time to head upstairs. He climbed the grand central staircase, the once polished oak now splintered and spongy beneath his feet, groaning under his weight with a sound that seemed to be warning him off. The second floor housed the patient rooms, rows of identical claustrophobic cells, each with a narrow, rusted bed frame and a single grime-coated window that hadn't seen a cleaning cloth in decades. Here, the atmosphere did shift slightly. The air felt heavier, not colder, but pressurized, like breathing through wet gauze or having an invisible hand resting on his chest. He felt a dull ache behind his temples, a headache induced by the sheer, contained density of the decay. Jason paused in room 212, the supposed site of the infamous matron's suicide by hanging. He placed his recorder on a broken nightstand, the silence stretching out around him, thick and absolute. He stood there, demanding an interaction, counting slowly to 60 while mentally composing the caption for his inevitable fail video. Silence. Disappointing, he whispered, retrieving the device and sighing dramatically for the benefit of the camera lens. He still felt nothing that couldn't be explained by poor circulation or the late hour. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic squeak of a piece of metal, likely the weather vane on the roof oscillating in the barely there wind. A monotonous, comforting sound of the outside world, reminding him this was all just a game. Jason, determined to find something worth the trespass, headed toward the largest room in the East Wing, the old solarium. This room was massive, designed to let natural light flood in for convalescing patients, though the light today was the sterile, unforgiving glare of the moon. Its eastern wall was composed of a dozen huge vertical windows, each hinged at the side, leading out to a rusted-out balcony. As he entered the solarium, the sense of emptiness returned, but with a different quality. It felt vast, unnervingly sterile, and cold in a way that defied the ambient temperature. The moon shone through the glass, casting long, dusty rectangles across the checkerboard floor, where the grime and mildew formed unsettling abstract patterns. Most of the windows were slightly ajar, having buckled over the years, allowing that faint wind to whistle a thin, melancholy, almost musical song. Jason set his camera on a tripod, angled perfectly to capture the entire expanse of glass. He walked to the center of the room, irritated that his hour here had yielded less than a leaky faucet. This was his final theatrical call-out. "All right, matron," he called out, his voice echoing sharply against the glass. "I'm here. I know what they say you did to those patients. The neglect, the restraints, the silent rooms. Are you going to deny it? Are you going to show me that you exist beyond local folklore, or are you just another urban legend to be debunked?" He paused, waiting for the crackle on the EMF, the drop in temperature, the classic sign. Nothing. He scoffed, turning to face his camera, ready to deliver a cynical closing monologue about the dangers of confirmation bias in paranormal research. And that, folks, is why 90% of these investigations, the rhythmic squeaking from the roof abruptly ceased. It didn't fade, it just cut off, as if snipped by a wire cutter. Jason froze. The wind had dropped completely. The room was now so quiet it felt like his own heartbeat was a deafening drumbeat against his ribs, the silence pressing in like a physical force. Then it happened. It wasn't a gentle shudder of glass or a slow, theatrical closure caused by a downdraft. It was a synchronized, violent act of pure, palpable fury. One by one, starting from the northernmost window and moving rapidly south, the dozen large, heavy windows on the solarium wall slammed shut. The sound was not just glass hitting wood, it was an explosive, metallic, crack-clang that pulverized the silence and assaulted Jason's ears. Each closure was an act of deliberate, impossible force, shuttering the frame of the entire building. The final window, the one directly behind him, shut with such absolute violence that a loud snap accompanied it, and a thick spiderweb crack immediately raced across the pane, a clear sign that the frame could not contain the rage being exerted upon it. Jason did not move. He did not breathe. He stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process the total violation of physics he had just witnessed. The poltergeist wasn't whispering or tapping. It was physically demonstrating overwhelming territorial rage. The air that had felt cold moments before now felt electric and scalding, pressing against his eardrums, smelling faintly of ozone and burning metal. He spun around, dropping the mic he held, his decade of arrogant skepticism dissolving into raw, primal terror. Through the row of now sealed windows, the moonlight felt hostile and accusatory, illuminating the thick, dirty glass like a wall built specifically to trap him. A new sound began, closer and deeper than the squeaking weather vane had ever been. It was the sound of a heavy, metal bed frame, the same kind he had seen in the patient cells, being dragged across the concrete floor of the room directly above him. Not pushed or scraped, but hauled with a malicious, rhythmic pull that vibrated through the structure and up into the soles of his boots. It was the sound of something immense and indifferent seeking him out. He snatched the camcorder from the tripod, abandoning every other piece of expensive equipment. He didn't need the EMF reading anymore. He had the sound. He had the undeniable, deafening evidence of physical objects moving with impossible, violent intent. He bolted for the door, tripping over a coil of forgotten cable. Scrambling to his feet, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, he glanced back at the row of closed windows. In the fleeting moment before he plunged into the dark hallway, he saw a fleeting, shapeless darkness coalesce in the glass reflection. A shadow that didn't belong to him, tall, jagged, and motionless, standing exactly where he had been moments before. Jason ran. He didn't care about stealth, professionalism, or his abandoned equipment. Those things belonged to the skeptical man he had been 5 minutes earlier. He heard the metallic of the bed frame stop directly over the door he was about to exit, and then a deafening thud as it was seemingly dropped. He plunged down the grand staircase, his foot missing a step and sending him tumbling, his terror providing the momentum. He never stopped, bursting out of St. Jude's Sanatorium into the pre-dawn air, gasping and shivering uncontrollably. He didn't get any chairs thrown. He didn't hear any discernible whispers. He just got a dozen windows slammed in his face by something ancient and violently angry. And that was more than enough to silence his cynicism forever. That night, Jason didn't just find a ghost. He found a furious warden who didn't want any visitors, and he walked away with a video file that would either make him a star or drive him insane.